bell rang 3 times that night. No one was supposed to be awake after curfew. The dorm lights flickered once, twice, then stayed dim like they were breathing. Someone whispered a prayer in the dark. Her voice trembled, just enough to make the silence heavier. I remember pulling my blanket higher, telling myself it was just a teacher making rounds. But teachers didn't wear shoes that echoed like that. They didn't stop outside our doors and listen. Then a scream, short, sharp, cut clean through the night. And just like that, silence. That was the first time I heard it. And that's how it started. The night they came back. I was 16 when I arrived at St. Helena's Girls' Boarding School. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a quiet place to focus, away from everything I was trying to forget. The first thing I noticed was the smell, wet grass, and old paint. And the second was how everyone smiled a little too much. The teachers, the porter, even the girls at the gate. All polite, all careful, like they were performing something rehearsed. The school stood high on a hill, built long before any of us were born. Tall windows, narrow halls, walls that carried sound like whispers. I remember the headmistress shaking my hand and saying, "Welcome home." She said it with such certainty that I almost believed her. Even now, I can still smell that hallway, like rain and rot. And every time I think of it, I swear I hear that bell again. My first week passed quietly, almost too quietly. No phones were allowed, no outside calls except Sunday evenings. The routine was strict, but that wasn't what bothered me. It was how silent the school felt once the sun went down. Every dorm room had a list of printed rules taped behind the door. Lights out by 9. No wandering after curfew. Keep windows locked. But there were others, rules no one wrote down. On my second night, my roommate Clara whispered them to me as we lay in the dark. If you hear footsteps in the corridor after midnight, don't look. If someone calls your name from the hall, don't answer. And whatever you do, don't ask about room 9. I laughed it off, of course. But that same night, I woke up to someone walking past our door. Slow steps, heavy breathing, then a whisper right outside. "Clara." She froze beside me and didn't move. After a long minute, the sound faded away. At breakfast the next morning, no one mentioned it. But a girl from the next dorm looked pale, her eyes red, her hands shaking. Her name was Elsie. She said she hadn't slept because someone kept calling her name 3 times. Later that day we had chapel. Everyone filed in, everyone except Elsie. The headmistress said she'd gone home suddenly. No one believed that. Her suitcase was still under her bed. That night, I checked the hallway myself. Empty, cold. But when I looked toward the far end where room 9 should have been, there was a door. Old wood, cracked paint, and a keyhole glowing faintly red like something inside was breathing. The next morning, that door was gone. Just a wall. And no one else seemed to remember it had ever been there. The next few nights blurred together. Study, dinner, lights out. But the whispers never stopped. Someone always seemed to be awake, even when every bed was filled. One evening, while the others were in the chapel, I stayed behind to finish an assignment. That's what I told myself at least. Truth was, I wanted to see that wall again, the one that hid room 9. There was a loose board under the window. When I pulled it back, something was tucked beneath, a small water-damaged notebook. It wasn't a student's journal. The cover had the school crest, old and faded, and inside were names, pages of names, each crossed out in red ink. At the bottom of the last page, a note in smaller handwriting said, "The bell rings for the forgotten." I wanted to put it back, to pretend I hadn't seen it, but curiosity wins over fear. So I hid the notebook under my mattress. That night, the bell rang once. The sound seemed closer, deeper, like it was coming from under the dorm. Clara asked me if I'd been reading anything strange. I said no. She didn't believe me. Her eyes looked hollow, sleepless. "Don't read it again," she whispered. Then she turned to the wall and started crying quietly. When I woke near dawn, my pillow was gone. I found it across the room beside the locked door. The diary lay open on the floor, and a new name had appeared in it. Mine. The power cut out just before midnight. The air was thick and heavy, like the whole building was holding its breath. I reached for my torch, but it wouldn't turn on. Then footsteps. Slow, measured, coming down the hallway. Each step followed by a soft scrape, as if something was being dragged. The first bell, then the second. Clara sat up in bed, eyes wide. "They're here," she said. Before I could ask who, the door opened on its own. Shapes filled the doorway. They looked unfinished. Faces blurred, mouths open but soundless, all of them staring straight at me. I stumbled back. My hand brushed the diary on the floor. When I touched it, the shapes froze. For a second, the whole room flickered. Light, shadow, light. A voice whispered, "Read it." So I did. The last page said, "3 bells to remember, 1 fire to end it." I grabbed a candle from the desk, the only light left, and ran. The hallway stretched longer than before, doors multiplying on both sides, every one of them whispering. I found the chapel at the far end, doors wide open for the first time. Inside, portraits burned without flame, faces melting off the canvas. The air filled with ash and voices. I dropped the diary on the altar, lit the candle, and whispered, "Be free." The moment the flame touched paper, a scream tore through the walls, hundreds of voices crying out at once. Then everything went white. They said it was an electrical fire, that I was lucky to survive. They found no trace of the diary, no records of any student named Clara. But I remember her hand, cold, trembling, pushing me toward the door before the ceiling fell. She said, "Don't forget us." It's been 5 years since that night. They rebuilt the school, smaller, cleaner, quieter. Sometimes I drive past it. The new students laugh by the gate, carrying their bags, taking photos. They don't see the old bell half melted, hanging by the chapel ruins. But I do, and sometimes when the wind is right, I still hear it ring. I was still a teenager when I got the music scholarship to St. Catherine's College. It was a small all-girls boarding school built in the 1950s, with stone corridors and high ceilings that swallowed sound. The chapel stood in the center of the compound, tall windows, white pillars, and a bell that hadn't rung in years. They said it stopped working after a storm hit one night in 1992. But I would learn later that wasn't the real reason. When I first arrived, I was happy. I had a small suitcase, a flute case, and a letter signed by the headmistress herself. Music, she said, is the heart of our school. And it was true. Every morning we sang hymns before breakfast. Every evening the choir practiced until the last bit of daylight faded behind the dorms. The sound carried to the school like water, steady, graceful, safe. At least at first. The first time I heard them sing, it was the second week of term. It was just after midnight, and I was half asleep. At first, I thought it was a dream, a faint melody floating from somewhere outside. Female voices, gentle but not sweet. They were humming something that sounded familiar, but not like any hymn we knew. It was slow, repeating, like a lullaby missing its words. I remember sitting up and listening, certain someone else would wake. But no one moved. The sound went on for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. Suddenly, as if someone had cut the air, I waited for it to return. It didn't. In the morning, I asked my roommate Gina if she'd heard it. She looked up from tying her shoes and said, "You mean the night choir?" Her tone was casual, like she was naming a school club. I laughed. "What's that supposed to mean?" She shrugged. Just what it sounds like. They sing sometimes. You get used to it. I waited for her to say she was joking, but she didn't. That day, during break, I asked one of the older girls, Ruth, about it. She gave me a long look and said, "Don't talk about them too loud." Then she leaned closer. Sometimes new students try to find out where the sound comes from. They never do, and they don't sleep well after. I thought she was teasing. You know how seniors like to scare juniors. So that night, when the lights went out, I decided I'd listen again. Not out of fear, just curiosity. But the more I listened, the more silence I heard. It was so heavy it made my ears ache. I eventually fell asleep. Nothing happened. The next night, it came back. This time, the melody was clearer. It came from outside the window, drifting like mist. No words, just that same low hum, harmonized perfectly. It sounded like a small choir practicing, except no one was allowed outside after 9 p.m. I reached for Gina's arm. She was awake. She said slowly, "Don't look." I asked why. She said, "They sing where the sound can't be seen. Just listen." Her voice trembled slightly. We lay there still, while the voices rose and fell like the tide. Then, one by one, they faded, until only one was left, a single voice humming the same tune slower and slower until it stopped completely. The next morning, Gina was quiet. When I asked her again, she said she didn't want to talk about it. I pressed a little, and she finally said, "It started before our time. A group of girls were in the choir. They had an accident during practice. They say it was lightning, but the headmistress never confirmed it. The next term, people started hearing the singing again. I asked how long ago that was. She said 10 years, maybe 12. Then she changed the topic. Over the next few days, I started noticing things. The chapel windows were always closed, even when the air was hot and sticky. The music room, where the instruments were kept, was locked every Friday evening and not open again until Monday. And the music teacher, Miss Daniels, always wore gloves, even indoors. The next Sunday, during choir rehearsal, I asked Miss Daniels about the storm in 1992. She froze for half a second, then smiled. "Why do you ask?" I said I'd read about it in an old school magazine. She said, "Ah, yes, the lightning strike. It hit the bell tower." She smiled again, but it didn't reach her eyes. It was a long time ago. We don't talk about it. She dismissed us early that day. That night, it rained. Rain in boarding school is louder than anywhere else. The roofs amplify every drop, and the gutters turn into rivers. I woke around 1 a.m. to that same melody, softer this time, blending with the rain. It sounded closer, like someone was humming right outside the dorm window. Gina's bed creaked. She sat up, eyes wide. This time, she didn't whisper, "Don't look." She just covered her ears. I couldn't help myself. I got off the bed and went to the window. The rain blurred everything, but through it, I could see faint movement near the chapel. Small figures, 4 or 5, standing in the open rain. They weren't holding umbrellas. They weren't moving, just standing and singing. My stomach tightened. Their uniforms were the same as ours. White blouse, blue skirt, black shoes. Only they looked cleaner, brighter, like new fabric under old rain. I blinked once, and they were gone. The next morning, Gina didn't speak to me. She avoided my eyes all day. When I finally cornered her after lunch, she said, "You looked, didn't you?" I nodded. She sighed and said, "They'll remember you now." I laughed, nervous. "Are you serious right now?" She just said, "Wait until Friday." Friday came fast. We had night prep till 8:30, lights out at 9. I lay awake, pretending to sleep. The rain hadn't returned, but the wind outside was restless. By midnight, the school was quiet. Then the first note came, faint, far, like someone warming up a voice. Gina rolled to face the wall. I sat up, heart pounding. The melody was different now, not the same gentle tune. It was slower, deeper. It had words this time. They weren't clear, but they sounded like Latin, maybe old hymns. The sound came from the direction of the chapel. I couldn't stop myself. I got up, slipped on my slippers, and stepped into the corridor. The hallway was cold. Every dorm door was shut, the lights off. I walked toward the chapel. With every step, the singing grew clearer. When I reached the glass corridor that led to chapel, the sound stopped. Just silence. I pushed the door open. It creaked softly. The air inside was heavy, thick with the smell of candle wax. And then, faint light. From behind the altar, I stepped closer. There were candles on the floor, forming a circle. In the middle of it lay sheet music, wet torn but arranged neatly. On top of it, a pendant shaped like a treble clef. When I picked it up, it was warm, too warm. A voice came from the back of the chapel. Put it down. I froze. It was Miss Daniels. She stood in the shadows, still wearing gloves. I stammered. I heard them singing. She said, "You shouldn't have followed it." I asked who they were. She walked forward slowly. Students. Once. They loved music too much to stop. Her eyes were shiny, like she hadn't slept in days. They sang during the storm, even after the lightning hit the tower. The roof collapsed. By morning, only the bell rope was left. I asked, "Why didn't anyone tell us?" She said, "Because the school doesn't believe in ghosts, only history, and history doesn't like noise." Then she took the pendant from my hand and whispered, "You didn't hear anything tonight. Go back to bed." I did. For the rest of the term, no one mentioned the singing, but some nights, the melody still floated through the walls. I never looked again. I tried to focus on classes, exams, normal life. But one evening, just before vacation, Miss Daniels called me to her office. She handed me a small envelope. Inside was the same pendant. She said, "You'll understand when you leave." And then she smiled, tired but real. That was the last time I saw her. 2 weeks later, during the holidays, my mother handed me a newspaper clipping she'd found online. It said, "Fire guts St. Catherine's Chapel after choir practice. No deaths reported. Cause unknown." They said the fire started from a lightning strike, but it hadn't rained that night. If you ever stayed somewhere that still feels alive long after you left, tell me. Your story might be the next one we share. Send it to darknarrativesubmissions@gmail.com. And if you're still awake, subscribe. Just make sure your lights are still on.